All right. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Complexity Lounge, a meetup where we gather to talk about all things related to complexity and complex adaptive systems. I'm Jocko Selberg, and somewhere out there spit polishing her complexity lenses is the always focused, never foggy Barbara Frontera, and together we co-host the lounge. Before we kick it off, just a few ground rules. We will be recording today's session, so if you do not wish to be recorded, please make sure that your camera and your microphone are turned off. After Thomas's talk, we will have a question and answer period and hopefully a nice conversation with all of you. Should you have a question or comment, you can either raise your Zoom hand or just send the question directly to Barbara via the chat with a big Q in front, and she will probably just ask you to read it out for yourself. And then just a reminder is that the recording will be posted to Vimeo on the Complexity Lounge page in the next few days. And that's where you'll find all other past videos. Today, we welcome Thomas Vander Wal to Complexity Lounge. Currently, Thomas is working with a major aerospace company where he leads the development and processes, strategies, and products that aim to enhance the work of developers and engineers across the organization. Today, Thomas will be discussing the multitude of complexity lenses that he has developed over the years and how they can help us in exploring various aspects such as social interactions, scaling thresholds, cyclical patterns, and much, much more. So Thomas, welcome to the lounge.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And really good to be able to talk to folks about the complexity lenses. So today, essentially giving a talk that is an overview of the complexity lenses. So this is an introductory, sort of an introductory background of what they are. I'm going to start off with sort of where they came from, why they exist, and essentially who they are for. So essentially complexity lenses are for organizations who are scaling. Trying to figure out why things are not working as they have grown, either doubled in size, have grown by 10%, or are planning to grow. And organizations that have leadership that have been through organizations that have scaled know that there are difficulties. Being able to plan for those difficulties that arise, how and why they happen, how to be better prepared for them, is one of the reasons why the lenses exist. It's also for mid-sized organizations who are looking at enterprise scale and understand that complexity is a known reality and they need to understand and be able to work through the complexity. They're running into issues that they weren't quite expecting, and they know that there's no way to do things simply or things are far more than just complicated. It also works for organizations that know one size fits no one. It's one of my favorite things is when leadership starts spitting this back in their presentations as a known. Sometimes they will follow it with we are buying one solution that everybody can use, which is also a little bit entertaining. But at least getting them saying the phrase that one size fits no one, I always find to be at least a good initial step forward. It is also for organizations tired of not understanding their needs and want improvement, but not more money thrown at solutions only to get similar results. Being able to understand their needs, understanding what their problem sets are, understanding how to understand the dimensions of what they are working with, the diversity of what they are working with, so that they're able to see and see that diversity, see the complexity as it exists, and understanding the small elements that are each in and of themselves, and then working against each other, and being able to break that down, have them see clearly through individual lenses, understanding needs, possibilities, and then being able to set them aside, pick up another lens, work through something much more simple, understand that really well, figure out what is relevant to them, and then pick up the relevant pieces, the elements and the components of them, and then start bringing them together to understand how they should look at things and work through things. Currently, there's about 80 or more complexity lenses when I last looked at my outline last night. It was about 84 lenses that are in there. Um, it continually grows. I think that I have everything that I have worked on and used that has been helpful in there. And every time I look at it, I realize, oh, something is missing. Sometimes it is work of my own that is missing. Within the last few months, I realized that Folksonomy was not in there, which I will uh, get to a little bit later. It's essentially emergent taxonomy. It's a term, Folksonomy is a term I came up with in 2004 to explain social bookmarking and what was going on with it, what made it valuable. But I didn't have it in my lenses, and it was something that I regularly use, and elements and components of it I regularly use in my lenses as well. So a quick overview of where it all started. It started with a discussion with Stuart Butterfield, who today is probably more better known for being the CEO and founder of Slack. Had a discussion with him in 2001, and essentially what came out of it was navigation is the wrong metaphor for everything we do on the web. Those of us who were in the discussion all vehemently agreed, and then someone was pressing enough to ask, well, what do we replace it with? And it got an awful lot of blank stares for many months. In March of 2002, I essentially stumbled into a model of attraction. Was watching a presentation of a digital artist having bees chasing each other around on a screen in a flash demonstration. And then he would change the polarity and the bees interaction would change drastically. And I walked out of that presentation thinking about attraction. I saw Stuart walk by and was like, what about this attraction thing? Is there something to it? And was completely subsumed by the presentation and started thinking about it and tracked Stuart down. I said, hey, the answer to navigation is possibly attraction. When we put a term into Google, we are attracting things to our screen. We are also pushing things away that are not related to it. So you put a catalyst in, it attracts things to it, repulses other things, so you get much better clarity. Within about 5 minutes, there was about 15 of us talking about model of attraction. It was my last day at that conference. And within hours, I was on a plane flying back home. And on that plane, I knocked out an essay that's about 3,000 or more words, essentially doing a full framing of the model of attraction. And pretty much since March of 2002, that has been a strong foundation for how I view the world, not only in web, but digital interactions and being able to frame things. The model of attraction then led to the Come to Me web and Come to Me intranet, and being able to rethink how we see things in the world around us, how we interact with digital environments, being able to think about feeds, being able to think about agents and aggregation. And that started to become a clear and core part of regular discussions about products and services for digital. Other models and patterns that came out of it started helping with understanding and explaining what are the elements of this, and being able to go deep, building tools and services, and being able to get things more right by thinking about things in the sort of attraction model. Following from the attraction model, started realizing that not only are we attracting things to ourselves, but we are going to different aggregation points and hubs, and the info clouds were a popular means of talking about things that were not ours. And we go out to an info cloud to find things, and started breaking those down into a personal info cloud where I control things. I tuck things away. These are things in my own environment, local info cloud, global info cloud, external info cloud, and how to work and manage across all of them. And I will dig into personal info clouds a little bit later. And then lastly, all this came to Folksonomy. And Folksonomy is essentially people putting tags on things and using their own identity as an element to being able to mark things and say, oh, this is cooking, this is Thai food, this is whatever your interest is. But being able to do it as an expression of your own vocabulary to re-find objects and to organize things, but it's essentially open and public to everybody. And it is that essential model of being able to use the model of attraction and keep things attracted to you based on context. And you're putting your own context on it and your own vocabulary. I'll get to folksonomy at the very end. In 2008, a friend of mine stated on Twitter that he'd been working on a 3D modeling exercise around data and that it was really hard. And I blurted back to him, you should try social. It's 6D or 7D, which being Twitter meant that others started asking, what are those other dimensions? And within a few days, I had shared out 11 or 12 more models and elements that I had regularly used in my work, a lot of it coming out of model of attraction, a lot of it coming out of trying to write a book on folksonomy, and realizing that an awful lot of the understanding of complexity and social interaction models that we depended on were not necessarily correct. I couldn't explain problems that I was running into. I couldn't explain solutions that we were running into based on the models. So essentially, being able to have these elements, and essentially in writing the book, I completely flattened and deconstructed everything that I knew. An awful lot of it coming from grad school and public policy, looking at social and complexity at scale, and being able to model it, to be able to understand what is happening and what happens if you change these small points within a social model at scale. What happens and how do they move? How does change happen or not happen? Is that change the intended effect that you were trying to have, and what are the consequences and sort of downsides of making those changes? And so I had a decent understanding and background in graduate school social sciences and social modeling that essentially became the foundation for an awful lot of what I was doing. And again, many of the lenses come out of that deep social science, and relating that to technology and that intersection of techno-social foundations. The foundations come from also complex adaptive systems, urban studies, similar domains where understanding many scales are at the core. And quite often you're not only looking at one scale at a time, but you are looking at many scales interacting. So something from a small group or a team that is working within a company of 100, 200 people working with a large enterprise of tens of thousands of people, if not more, and they're selling to their customers who are out in the millions. So you're looking at scales. How do you work across these? How do you think about them? Hold them all within tension at the same time, and be able to see them clearly at the same time. And out of this became the Connected Company book. In 2010, I had about a little over 40 social lenses or complexity lenses. And one of my friends, Dave Gray, reached out and said, hey, my company has been bought by another company. They have a heavy focus on enterprise social. And they've been walking me through their understandings, and it's not making any sense. I know you have your complexity lenses. Can you walk me through them? So pretty much through 4 full days plus, I walked Dave Gray through the 40 lenses at that time, or a little over 40 lenses. He went through more than a case of index cards and had them spread all over his living room and dining room, so that he could see everything at once, and came back and essentially said, hey, this looks an awful lot like cities. And I said, well, there's a really good reason for that, because an awful lot of our understanding of social at scale comes from the last 100 to 120 years or so of social sciences, looking at human encampments, going from people putting down a foundation and building a house, all the way up to cities. And there are certain things at certain scales that start happening. Certain places where you get certain roles that start taking place. There are certain There's certain infrastructure that needs to be put into place, who owns it, who runs it, how is it managed, and all of that comes out of social sciences and understanding the complexities of being able to do that at various scales. Um, and then he came back a few days later and said, "Hey, I've got something that I need you to read," which was a blog post about connected company, essentially taking the lenses, conveying it to cities, and taking cities and then turning it and taking that same understanding and turning that into understandings of companies at scales. And that turned into the Connected Company book, which the company that had bought Dave Gray's company, the CEO of that company wanted to own the copyright, even though he had no involvement in it. So I kept my portion of the contract and just advised Dave through it so I could keep my own intellectual property of the lenses fairly clean. Um, and Dave wrote essentially a book that he wanted to write on that was lightweight, easy access, that was quick to read, and business people didn't have to spend a whole lot of time or have another business book on their shelf that was too complicated and needed too much time to actually go through and read. And the book came out in 2012. It's still fairly relevant. I still get asked about work around it, and not doing any work around connected company and lenses, but still use the lenses and do mentoring and advising around them. So today I've teased out more than 80 complexity lenses out of my work, from mostly stretching from the late 90s through late 2010s. There are new things that I still am running across, going through things, working through lenses, the elements and components. One of the things I've been doing is trying to get them all written out, which becomes a little bit daunting. There's essentially 20 lenses that are elements that are works of others, like the Connectfin framework, Wardley mapping, the verifier method, hierarchy are some of them that I lean on quite regularly. And in helping others see the complexity to find clarity in their needs and where to focus for improvement, I often get people coming back and saying, "Hey, this 7 or 8 figure savings was conveyed from the clarity that this provided." And a lot of that savings comes from not buying a tool or service that didn't fit their needs. They understood their needs far better, and they realized that they had a large gap and there wasn't a match for what their needs were, how they needed to move forward. But they were buying a tool based on assumptions from the industry and from markets as to what they needed, rather than understanding their own needs first, their own scale first, and their own complications. And so one of the things that's really important as we look at the lenses is that we're essentially mapping out a better understanding of the environments around us within organizations. But as we are mapping things out, it's always important to understand that the map is not the territory. And as we're modeling through things, the model is not reality. And as we think through those and just being able to see things more clearly, one of the core things that we're trying to do is essentially go through the lenses, moving from the unknown unknowns, moving to the unknown known things, and getting them into known knowns. And I've worked in environments where there have been a whole lot of known unknowns or unknown knowns in organization, particularly within intelligence community, where one part of an organization understands what is going on, but the part that is wanting to take steps and to remediate whatever is going on, they do not understand that background, and they are not part of the group that knows what is known. So how to be able to surface that information. So from a very high level, looking at the 80 lenses, or 80 plus lenses, part of it looks at the use environment. So there's lenses around sort of distance and proximity, and that can be physical proximity, and have worked with organizations where having a business on two different floors, there are two completely different cultures um, between the two floors. And they do not understand what the other floor is doing. Um, have also worked with organizations where there is a large headquarters, and 40 miles away is their second largest office space, and they have completely different vocabularies. And they have open desk policies, so you can hot desk between the two environments, and people that you talk to that bounce between the two buildings and two facilities. So it takes about 2 weeks to understand how to find, where to get a pen, how to be able to understand where a supply closet is, because it's a supply closet in one place, it is something completely different in the other environment. Understanding the devices that people are working with, looking at pace layering and temporality. And along with that comes sort of looking at epidemiology and sort of the spread of things, knowing that there are various stages that everything goes through, understanding that everybody that is new to something will go through various stages as they move through a process. But different people with different skill sets may go through those processes at different speeds. But as you start people at different times, you need to understand that people are in many different stages at the same time, and understanding why and how do you people move through a process. And some people will just get to a certain stage and stick, because that is the level that they are looking at, and that's fine. Also looking at attention, bringing into the model of attraction and various filters around those, and then also understanding culture or cultures, because very rarely does an organization or an environment have just one culture. It is many cultures coming in, and as soon as you think that you have your culture defined and understood, it changes. You have hired new people, you have merged with a new organization, you've sent people out for training, and voila, you have no longer one culture. You're back to dealing with many cultures and many understandings, which is the norm. The next is understanding the user and the use for what is going on. Understanding various personality types and traits, understanding mental models, expertise, skills, various work models that may be in place, being able to understand sort of depth of use and mastery, and where does that come into play. Being able to look at sort of emergent complications. Things may start in one place, and as they mature, as they grow, and as something becomes more advanced, it completely changes everything. But being able to be mindful of that and understanding sort of where you are on a maturity scale, that becomes incredibly helpful to use. Since most work is social, and most things that we're dealing with have a social aspect to them, being able to understand the social components of it are very important. One of the things that I'll go through is sort of this difference of collective, cooperative, and collaborative. But then also looking at social comfort. In 2010, was working with an awful lot of companies that were completely obsessed with trust. And trust was the way forward. The definition of trust, there are 7 or 8 definitions of trust. And when you ask people about trust and what they think about it, they will bounce between the different definitions within a sentence, within a thought. And it became a completely unusable term, and I banned it. And it was one of the best things that I ever did. And so when people start saying, oh, we need to focus on the trust, our customers, our clients trust us, I'm like, I have no idea what you are talking about with trust. Use other words to explain trust to me and what you mean. So being able to come out of that, one of the things, there were many different terms, one of them that resonated and I could ask people questions about and get really solid answers was comfort. Are you comfortable in this environment? Are you comfortable participating? What makes you uncomfortable and unwilling to be able to participate? What is holding you back? What are your concerns? And that became a really helpful component, as well as I will use some of the other terms that people use in various situations as well. Is somebody reliable? There's a whole, there's 7 or 8 terms, but most often I use comfort and social comfort as sort of the guiding path. Also understanding roles, whether they are formal roles or informal roles. Some of them come down to personality. We'll go through 20 social roles a little bit later. Understanding focus, and then also understanding scale. And scale comes into play in a lot of different aspects of the lenses. There we go. And lastly is work focus. So you're needing to get something done, understanding workflow or the various workflows in your organization, the work models and how teams work. Teams became an incredibly important focus for an awful lot of the work, and being able to get things done and have things enabled. Understanding what the deliverables are, how you understand what your deliverables are, how they are built, how they match with your workflows and so forth. The work cycles, attention cycles, how you go about planning, and then managing and your operations. And so that's sort of a high level of most of the 80 plus social lenses. There are some that sort of are in the cracks between things. And quite often the lenses will work with one lens and then pick up something based on what is discovered in one lens and then use another for clarification. And the lenses are not only for discovery, but they're also for learning and sort of teaching basic foundations of more simple concepts to get them in place, because quite often leaders and people who are working on things do not have the background to cover all of this. And they're kind of going into things blindly. So being able to give them a foothold of simple understanding for some of the complications, some of the simple things in their own environment without anything else impinging on it and influencing it is really helpful. So when using the lenses essentially have 3 levels. There's the overall lens. They quite often have many elements underneath them, and each of those elements may have many components and subcomponents of them. But essentially what we're trying to get through is to get a greater understanding, and through that you have a greater ability to make successful decisions or more successful decisions. So one of the outputs of work is essentially being able to map various different areas, and being able to use the lenses to tease things out, to be able to see things and being able to say, okay, here are all the different dimensions that we have, things that we are needing to look at if we're looking at collaboration, being able to do knowledge capture. How do we find things? How do we work on things that are current? How do we refine things that are legacy? Do we archive them? How do we refine them? How do we, if we're working on a project and we know that we have done something about 5 or 6 years before, how do we bring all of that back into easy view? How do we, attract that back to our desktop or to an environment? And so it's, this is a sample that is fairly close to result from 3 different projects. And that came out somewhat similarly, which is a little bit of a surprise, because usually things don't align as tightly. Each organization's different, and some of the models and some of the things within this are different. 2 of them had 2 different fifth branches off of these that pertain to their organizations. But essentially being able to tease this out in a couple days to a couple weeks, and essentially having each one of these as essentially a work product underneath each one of these final nodes that they were working on that came out and what came out of this. So now looking at some of the lenses, probably the easiest place to start with social lenses is one of the few heavy metaphors. I tend to stay away from metaphors, try to stay more tightly to um, things that are more literal and as they actually are. But this one I continually find to be really helpful entry point. It's the social progression of fire. And essentially, if we think of uh, our social interactions and how they go from hearing something, reading something, a small snippet, and then aggregating it, going through different scales and different models and being able to get something out of it at the far end, using the social progression of fire is a fairly good metaphor that people can then map to other things. And following this, I will go through a more literal mapping of how this tracks. But essentially, we start off with sparks, which can be messages. We can see something in Slack or Teams. We have a few friends who are interested in, um, being able to take something with AI and being able to do modifications with it, and how would that influence products that we're working on. And it could be a product that needs to be shipped globally, but they're like, hey, is there something here? Can we use AI to do modifications of our existing product line? And you're like, okay, let's get these people together who have brought this up and they're pointing to different sources. Is there something really here or is there not? So essentially, you take the sparks and then pull them together into a campfire phase. So you're moving from out of Slack or Teams into something that is built to aggregate the information, have essentially discussing or sharing viewpoints, perspectives, being able to gather research and information. Sometimes what you're aiming to have come out of it becomes the product of it. Sometimes it will take a right turn and you will find that no, this isn't what we were looking for, but something else is coming out of this. So quite often you'll have more than one element or component that is looked at. You'll have three, maybe six, maybe 10 different options, but essentially the different options are being researched, they're being looked at, and you realize that, hey, there's one or two of these that actually look like they might be really good. Maybe we should bring it up to the larger company. Let's get legal involved. Let's get marketing involved. Let's get packaging, manufacturing, and our global compliance folks. Let's get them all involved in this. And so you move from the campfire, add a little bit more fuel, and you've got a bonfire going. So you've got more people that are looking at this, the social interactions for the tools, how people interact. All of that changes. It completely changes the social interactions as well as the tool that's needed to be able to do this at that level. And you'll quite often find that from this bonfire, you'll have legal go off and start their own campfire, have discussions around that. You may have legal meeting with global compliance, working with packaging and wanting to make sure that everything is in line. And you're like, hey, this, we've got a path forward. We have found some problems in what we were looking at, but we think that we have found solutions for those problem sets, and we're ready to essentially go and make this an actual thing. So that it changes from a bonfire with an awful lot of people looking at it and an awful lot of people having input, going to a small team that is working to build a torch. That is something that you can build, it's reliable, you can hand it off, and it's repeatable. And so you've gone from these sparks to campfire, sorting out what is there, what is not there, and being able to hold on to ideas that work and don't work, and then being able to surface that to a larger group to be able to get buy-in and find what works or doesn't work. And then being able to figure out that, yeah, there really is something that we can do here. Let's turn it into a real thing. But they're essentially looking at four different scales, four completely different social interaction models between them. And essentially with those different social interaction models being different, there's essentially four different tool types that need to be involved to be able to get this to work well. Quite often, most organizations will have one tool that they think can work for all of this. Sometimes they'll have two. I've worked with an awful lot of vendors over the years. And the social interaction of fire has turned into marketing materials for three or four of the different vendors at various stages. At one point, Jive was using it, and they gave me feedback, and they're like, the campfire is the most popular component of our whole platform. Once customers realize that we've got a campfire and that you can take these small pieces, go from discussions and discussion threads, turn that into a campfire, work on it either publicly, semi-publicly, or privately, and then being able to take it back out to everybody, get input, and then being able to move it into a project framework and have traceability through that whole thing, being able to go back to the original spark, going back to the decisions and so forth, that becomes very helpful for them. And one of the ones that I always am pleased by is when I look at the current Salesforce marketing materials. And I talked to Salesforce quite a bit. And at one point they were using the social progression of fire. But when they talk about their own marketing and their own discussions, they have a campfire that is a main part of their marketing materials right now. And it's been that way since about 2015 or 2016. And they use this model to talk about things internally at various different levels. So if we take the social progression of fire and move it a little bit out of the analogy and metaphor realm and start looking at differing social perspectives, we can start getting to things that are a little bit closer to reality. And so one of the things in the mid 2000s, I was traveling an awful lot. One of the places I was traveling to for work conferences was England, and quite often would stop in London for a day or two and walk down the Thames. And the Millennium Bridge is something that always stood out to me, and I was always amazed at the different perspectives as you get closer. Just sort of how the sort of the tendrils that come out of it and support it, how it sort of changes the skyline and just the different perspectives as you're looking through it. This one day, as I was walking past the Millennium Bridge, there was a whole bunch of art students all lined up, all with different perspectives, all drawing completely different perspectives and focus of the Millennium Bridge. And each one was completely different from the other, not only from their view, but also what they chose to focus on. And very much like that with social tools and social environments, we need to understand all the different perspectives that we're dealing with. And looking first at one of the social perspectives that's quite often missed, which is the personal. Being able to understand what individuals need to be able to interact, what they need for social comfort, but also what are they getting out of this? Is it a place where they can put their own information? Is it a place where they go to find other people's knowledge? How do they hold on to it? How do they find new things? How do they stay current and so forth? And so an awful lot of social platforms focus on the social, but they don't necessarily focus on the personal well. And so it's one of the areas that I can always call out and be able to have a sort of a stake in the ground and saying, what about this? Where does this fit? How are we thinking about this? As you're looking at product selection, as you're looking at how your work in your company progresses and is made available, understanding that person may have many different maturity levels, different understandings, and how do you take account of all the different views? So now getting to more of the differentiation between the different types of social interaction. And the first one is collective. And the collective, very much like the campfire, is essentially people coming together. They have common interest or there is common knowledge, and they're essentially trying to build a collective of knowledge that is a whole. They're not necessarily paying attention to what each other is posting. They're just trying to aggregate, take things out of their own libraries, write things out of their own understanding and experience. And whatever the focal lens is for that collective and that group, that is essentially what they're working on and sharing around. And so you're able to look at it and being able to sort of see if there's any gaps. You may have a perspective that is missing or expertise that's missing and add somebody to that collective to be able to fill in those gaps. But it's essentially getting a full understanding, and it's not so much interacting between people, but it's more that collective as a group as well as a collective of knowledge. The next one is more akin to the bonfire, and it also has different scales. And so it's the cooperative. In the cooperative, you're still having that same central focus, except people are paying attention to what each other is saying and they're interacting with each other. It's not just about what they're sharing and putting into it. It is the comments that they have around it, and things that they are sharing, explanations, sort of people saying, asking challenging questions or having positive criticism and saying, you know, you may have missed this, and you're like, oh yeah, completely did miss this. But someone seeing that conversation will pop up and say, well, here seem to be solutions around this. But we still have different social interaction models around the different scales, from the team to the group to the community and then out to the network. And so for the team is essentially trying to work together to get their job done, being able to share information between themselves. They know what their goals are. They know what they need to be able to deliver. I have a slide a little bit later that captures the core tool types that are needed for successful teams. Teams and focus on teams is something that it's one of the rabbit holes I will dive down into if I run across a new team type, or a new model for how teams function and work, and just sort of add it to the collection. So there's a collection of lenses, and sometimes the lenses and the elements and components have essentially collections of different models within them. And teams are one of those that I sort of collect. The next level up from the team is essentially the group. So you're not necessarily working on the same project, having a same delivery, but you have an interest, whether it's in a domain, you have a common interest. It's essentially working together more or less as a whole around a common viewpoint, a common discipline, or focal point. The next scale up is you have essentially a community, which can be many different groups that have come together under common interest as a whole. Looking at something like Reed's Law, where his conjecture is that people join groups where they find people who have similar interests. One of the things that is sort of a corollary to that is that people will leave a group and start splintering a group, and we'll go from 100 people who are all one group and start having subgroups when they start seeing differences or there are sort of sub-interests between them. And then you'll have people completely fracture and move off, and they'll see things within the group that are completely counter to their beliefs. They will leave. That group will form somewhere else or form on their own. But being able to understand that within a community, there are many different groups and subgroups within it, aggregating, talking amongst themselves, but then also interacting across between the different environments. And lastly, looking at a network scale, where you've got not only communities, but you have communities of communities. You have a community that is surrounding an enterprise organization that is selling to many different communities and as a part of many different communities for manufacturing, shipping, sharing what they are working on all around the globe. And it's that network of networks that becomes the focal point. And so that wraps the cooperative piece, and being able to have that mindset and those elements that are the core components of cooperative, and then looking of the last element of those, which is the collaborative. And the collaborative is essentially that torch piece. It is a small group. They are trying to build one thing, have one output. Denning and Yarnovsky had a really good article in the mid 2000s talking about real collaboration. And they're very old school collaboration folks, not this newfangled digital collaboration. And talking essentially about what you have in real collaboration is that you've got negotiators and mitigators. You essentially have a decider, or you have the group essentially negotiating what one path is going to be the end result. If you've got we were talking about Vienna earlier, so you've got a statue of Mozart. Mozart can't have six different heads, or may. That's one of the decisions you need to make, but you have one sculpture. What is that one sculpture going to look like? How is it going to work? How are you going to work together to be able to get to that one sculpture? So you need to negotiate, mitigate, and interact with each other in polite or combative means to be able to get to that one endpoint. But as we look at reality, not only do we have each of these different models, but we quite often have them all within the same organization. And we're leaning on each one of these as we are working throughout our day. And essentially having all of them working in conjunction with each other. And one of the things we need to hold it all together is a communication layer. How to be able to search between them? How do we be able to essentially have something where we can say, hey, there's a collective group that is looking at this subject. You may have a community that is looking at something for a new employment policy, and there is a group that is looking at a component of it. And it's something they've been researching and digging into for a while, but they're not connected to that. And so being able to use communication to join people together, to link things together in an easy manner. And there's other pieces beside this that quite often that also get left out of this, that are perspectives that make a big difference when you understand them. Essentially looking at the collective, cooperative, and collaborative, those are really good starting points. And as you get a little bit deeper, the awareness of the quiet perspectives becomes relevant. One of the things you start looking at is the newbie. How do you do onboarding? Somebody who is completely new to each of these environments, and they don't have any familiarity with it. How do you introduce it to them? How do you explain what this is, how it works, how do they progress through things? Another one that you need to be conscious of is the service owner. Who are the admins, who are managing things? There's a whole lot of needs that they need. Quite often this gets left out. The funding isn't there. The resources that are needed to actually run things and to manage things is not fully there. And quite often people look at the tools and the activity and forget that there is infrastructure needs behind it. And then lastly, how do you deal with sort of the external developers or your external folks who can be consultants, who can be contractors, but there are people who are not part of the inner circle. How do you bring them in and have them be a part, but yet hold them apart from the whole? And so essentially this is a look at one of the lenses with elements and subcomponents within it. But one of the important things is being able to take the lenses and start looking at not only one lens, but another lens with relevance that is close to it. So now taking a look at sort of a depth of perspective. And so we had social perspectives, but now looking at sort of taking that newbie and looking at sort of a maturity process and how that will impact things. And so as we're looking at sort of the depth of use perspective, we need to realize that people, when they start using a tool or they start using a service, or even if they start, starting in a workplace, where they are now is going to be very different from where they are in 6 months, 2 years, and so forth. So been using this part of the deck for a long time. So some of these actually don't know that much of any of this exists any longer. But essentially for a non-user, you need to understand, how do I get them to sign up? What does this mean? One of the things that I really liked with this interface was it explained what the privacy policy was in the form field. And so being able to say, this is not going to be spammed when you're giving us your email address. The other thing that I also really like on this one is also being able to have an explainer on the side, and being able to have more room. So when you click into different form fields, it will say, giving you an understanding of what is actually there. So once you have people signed up using your service, they essentially start off as a non-contributing collective user. So they're seeing the aggregation of everything. It is they're not contributing, they're not sharing, they're not voting on anything, they're not giving thumbs up, favoring anything. They are just sort of looking at this wall of fire hose output, and figuring out if what somebody gets when they first join. If it is a fire hose, do they do a selection process so they are seeing subsets that are relevant to them? Essentially, how do you think through this first onboarding and this initial experience? Essentially, what people will get to relatively quickly is a non-contributing selective user. So they have figured out what is of interest to them within this environment. How do I keep it near and reach? How do I keep it essentially attracted to me? Can I get notifications if there are new things within this? But they have realized that things that are of primary interest to them, they can filter and sort within them, and being able to take that, but they're still not contributing anything. The next logical step that most take is going to being a light contributing user. So they're selective, but they're also beginning to take action on things that are already in there that others have put in the system. So they're commenting, they're voting something up, they're bookmarking things, but it's essentially light contributions based on what is already within that environment, but they're not essentially taking that step of doing initial contribution. And then we have sort of the far end of the scale, where you have heavy contributing users who are doing an awful lot of work, sharing things just because they enjoy sharing things, all the way to having a some underlying driving force to be able to put things out there. But being able to understand that there are different levels of maturity, there's different interaction levels with these, but essentially, this lens of depth of perception, it marries quite well with within a perception matrix, or a matrix of perception. So we can take that depth of user experience and then map it to the social perceptions to be able to get a matrix. Have used this quite often in work, and within each one of these cells, there's 10 or more questions that commonly look at, which is, why would the person return to this level? What activities do they need to be able to perform within this cell? Most often, you're trying to get people to move from the left cell over to the right cells. So being able to say, what do I need to do to be able to get that person to make that step to the next cell over to the right? What are the things that are standing in their way? Do they have interest in moving in that direction or not? And that's fine if they don't. But then there's also being able to look at, where are they participating, and looking at sort of a heat map of what do we have as far as social perception of sort of that the different types of interactions that they use. Where are people starting out as a new user? What are they doing in a collective? What are they doing in collaborative? Are they mostly using team environment? Where are they? How are they moving up and down? Are they interconnecting various things? And so it becomes a relatively good sort of cross focus and marrying lenses together. There are times where the left-hand column, that is only like 3 or 4 things rather than the full set, just because the organization is not, they don't have interest in the other components, or what they are working on isn't relevant to the different scales. So now shifting slightly and looking at scaling and roles. And so the social scaling is something that is always intriguing to me. Uh,
Thomas,
yes,
Thomas, before I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, and I know people are going to have to start to drop off. So if you don't mind, I'd like to ask if anybody has any questions on what's been
sure.
covered so far. So before we move on, does anybody have any questions on what Thomas has talked about so far? I know one question that has come up, and I'd like to cover this before we go is where do your lenses reside? Like, is there a place where people can go and see all of these lenses that you have developed over the years?
There is not yet. It's one of the things that I'm working on. So, um, one of the blogs that I have is Personal Info Cloud. I haven't posted there in a while. But one of the things that I had started doing was essentially walking through some of the lenses there. Over time, I have written some of them up, not not under the guise of being a lens, but just as models that I'm working through, and have been using and been finding helpful. One of the things that I'm in the midst of doing is taking these 80 plus lenses, and the full outline of all the 80 lenses is over 1,000 bullet points. And each one of those bullet points essentially is a page or more of description, or can be. And so it's figuring out how to get things out and shared in a relevant manner um, is something I've been working through the last few years, and figuring out. Quickly moved from, oh, I could put this in a book, um, just because there is far too much to put in a book. And sometimes individual lenses could be a book in and of themselves. Um, but right now, Personal Info Cloud is likely the place. I also have vanderwal.net. I also have social lenses, a few different domains around social lenses and complexity lens. Um, and there may be something showing up there, essentially currently moving things from outline into sort of a interconnected notes model. Had started using Wiki years ago. The Wiki tool that I had wasn't helpful. And then my note taking tool, where I could interconnect and tag things, it crashed. And in 2020, I moved to Obsidian, which allows backlinking and so forth. So it's essentially like a personal wiki. So working in that environment to write things out, capturing all the lenses, sub lenses. And as I'm going through that, and I'm been updating the outline and filling things in, which is meaning that there are more bullet points and sometimes more lenses.
So many
Um,
things.
so there's not one place. Um,
So what I'm going
but
to
essentially,
suggest then, yeah, what I'm going to
yeah,
suggest for those of you here that, and for anybody that is interested in
yeah,
this is you will share of the various links to these things to Jocko and I, and we will
yep,
post them on the meetup page
right,
after the meetup so that you all can then go and explore Thomas's work,
yep.
more in depth. And then I have a question. I just need to make sure that this is clear in my own mind because, I might not be as smart as I look, or think I am. But so, for example, when you were taking us through the Spark torch uh, campfire bonfire
Yep.
conflagration model,
Yeah.
that is an example of a lens. Are each of those lenses within some larger lens, or are they like one lens? Is my
So that would
question.
be essentially a whole lens
Okay.
with elements within them.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
and so it's interestingly, when I start with that, people start seeing things that they hadn't thought about before. And there's a whole lot of no duh moments that they have never considered. They're like, oh, this is really simple. I understand this, which is sort of the whole point of lenses, is that there
Yeah.
are things that you know, but you don't know that you necessarily know them.
Mhm.
They are clear once you understand them. They're like, oh yeah, of course I've always known this, but you didn't know that until you know. One of the things I continually bring up to people that I work with is like, you can't know something before you know it. Like, I can't hold you responsible for knowing something if you don't know it. This is not possible. Um,
Don't say it out loud. No,
Yeah,
I mean, I'm just like, as you go through this, is like, I'm just trying to keep straight in my head what's a single lens, what,
right.
which of how these things group together. So that was
Yeah.
very helpful.
Yeah.
Does anyone, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So like the social perspectives, and that's one lens. The depth of social perspective, or the depth of perspective, that's another lens. So it has different elements within it. Within that, there are components.
Right. Yeah. So yeah. So does anyone else have any questions before we move on? Or, did I just make things worse for everyone? Or did that help? Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat. I don't see any hands raised. So let's keep going.
All right. I think we'll soon get to something that may be familiar to many in this section. But essentially looking at social scaling. One of the things that um, is important to understand in complexity is sort of what scale are you looking at, and what scale with people. How many people are involved in it? There's a whole lot of different social scales and hurdles. Um, and one of the things when I was reading through Jeffrey Rust's book on scale, and it may have even been in the introduction, one of the things that rang insanely true was people talking about their problems and where they are stuck. You can quite often tell what scale their organization is, or their environment is. Have worked with an awful lot of startups, and startups essentially that are 2 to 3 years old and are no longer in the 2 to 5 person stage or 10 to 15 person stage, but they're in the hundreds. But the problems that they're running into, or the uh, things that are giving them an awful lot of concern, those things are relevant at certain scales. At a certain point, if somebody is talking about, hey, we need an accountant or we need an HR person, I know exactly the range of how many. You're somewhere between 75 people to 150 people, if you're asking those questions. If you're looking for a full-time HR person, if you're looking for various different tools, or you're running into culture problems, quite often it's a scaling issue. It also might be a distance issue, and that distance can be 2 different floors in the same building, or it could be a much larger distance. So essentially holding apart scaling as people becomes relatively important when looking at the lenses and trying to understand complexity. So one of the things that had worked with very early on, in sort of the early Web 2.0 days, was working with an awful lot of the companies that were doing the social well, they weren't quite platforms then, they were just sort of social websites. Flickr, very early Twitter, knew an awful lot of the founders, and was quite often asked really early on, hey, can you look at this and give us some feedback? We're stuck with this, or we're seeing this. Can you give us some guidance or pointers how to move through things? And so essentially looking at scaling and functionality, you've got the number of people participating on one axis, you have number of objects in the system. Optimally, somewhere down the middle or middle-ish, there will be a line of optimality of certain number of people, certain number of objects. There's enough to keep people entertained at various different levels, keep them coming back, getting people to engage. But essentially where everybody starts out is at very small numbers with very few things in the system. And one of the things that successful platforms will do is make sure that there is a personal value or use that comes out of using a social platform where there is no social. And so being able to share bookmarks, annotate bookmarks, being able to essentially share things of interest that day. And if all that is happening is you are going back and seeing what you had for lunch last Saturday, great. And if that's a value to you, that becomes helpful. But essentially, one of the things that happens is you move beyond that personal use as things grow, and it's not necessarily functioning as a full social mature platform, but you sort of hit the serendipity stage, where it's like you stumble into somebody else who has that same sandwich on Saturday, and you realize that, oh, they like the same type of of bread, and that bread is driven from traveling to a certain place around the globe. And all of a sudden, you have these sort of serendipitous moments and people making connection. And it's no longer just about a sandwich, but it's now about travel to this location and talking about this culture that makes this incredible bread that is great for sandwiches on Saturday. And so it's the serendipity level sort of happens. Things are not necessarily functioning as needed. This also happens in enterprise when a new platform gets rolled out and they're just like, there's nothing happening here. And so being able to have things sort of primed and ready, having content in the system. So you're sort of stepping over that personal use stage, getting into sort of a serendipity level before you move on to something larger. The next level is having a mature social tool. So being able to have something that is functioning. You've got many different interest groups, you've got many different discussions going on. You have people who are voting things up. You've got recommendation systems that are coming out of it, both things that are intended as well as sort of not as intentional, but are working quite well. And so being able to have that mature social tool is sort of that optimal point, but that isn't where the scale ends, is that you quite often have things that are moving beyond that, which are complex social systems. One of the things that Flickr ran into within about a year or two of their photo sharing site was that people were starting to build community around certain types of photos. And they also found that people were playing games and having contests and being able to, one of them was a squared circle. So taking a square photo of a circular object, whether it is a cover of a sewer, whether it's a button on somebody's jacket, but taking a square photo around it, and who could be the most creative with that. And so they had all these different uses that people were doing with the Flickr site. But one of the things the Flickr team was realizing was if they started supporting these more closely, it would start breaking their core product that 80 to 90% of the customers and people using the site were there for. And so being able to figure out how to work within a complex social system that has sort of these divergent patterns and use cases is one of the things that you realize that you have something that's successful is when it starts working in ways that it isn't intended to start working. But then you need to figure out, do you embrace that? Do you not embrace it? Do you just sort of take a laissez-faire approach and let it happen? While keeping an eye on it to make sure, nothing nefarious is going on. And so started using this model in sort of mid 2005, explaining it to new tools that were popping up. And it's like, here are the things that you're going to be expecting. Here's like what the next 6 months to 18 months are going to look like. How do you think, setting up systems for thinking through these early on became relatively important. And then late 2005 and in January of 2006, started sharing this with in talks as well as workshops that I was putting on. And in January 2006, I had a workshop that I put on, and there was 5 people in the room that said, "Oh, do you know about Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework? This sounds awfully similar." And I'm like, "I don't know what you were talking about." And it took me a few months to track it down. And then took me a few months to actually understand what was going on within this. And it was Jerry Mikulski who had Dave Snowden on his podcast, the Yitan podcast. And it was really helpful framing. And I'm like, I now understand I understand what he's talking about in Cynefin framework, but also I understand why people think that it is similar. And sort of hitting that socially mature and complex system. But essentially the complex system is happening in the serendipity level as well. But being able to understand going from something that is simple, easy to understand, which is very rare, particularly if you're dealing with anything with humans involved, And you're very quickly into the complicated and quite often very quickly into the complex. And you can no longer think of the world in simple terms and complicated terms, but you need to deal with things and understand that they're going to be complex and how to deal with them and how do you see through them. So very quickly in an awful lot of my work, I bring out the Dave Snowden Cynefin framework, and I have a strong fondness for early Cynefin framework understandings. And just being able to understand, there are no best practices once you get out of simple, and simple disappears once you get it beyond just a handful of people. So there are truly no best practices in a business world. There can be good practices. More often or not, there are practices that may work and may not work, but you need to understand how they may work and not work. And one of the things that when complex adaptive systems popped up, I was in grad school in public policy in the mid 90s, and my quant professor was like, keep an eye on this. It's coming out of Santa Fe Institute. Complex adaptive systems, and it's likely going to change how we do quantitative analysis of environments. And around 2005, I stumbled across a book sort of explaining complex adaptive systems and emergent system patterns. And it was absolutely hooked from that point on, and it became a core part of my work as well. And just being able to understand that most of the things that we are looking at are complex, not necessarily chaotic. If they are in chaos, you're essentially not understanding what is going on. And so we have tools and systems that allow us to see and sort of take shape or make shapes out of things that seem chaotic, and being able to find patterns to start bringing them into understanding of the complexity. And so it's, and the disorder in the middle is something that is really easy to fall into. Which is one of the reasons why, kind of like the old Cynefin framework model, is that if you're not understanding the various stages and various levels, you're quite often swimming in that sort of disorder. And you haven't quite sorted out that complexity is something you need to embrace and move forward with. And so one of the things, and working with Dave Gray on the Connected Company, was the way that he works and the way that his company Explained worked was essentially sketching and drawing systems and drawing interactions of companies and models. So there are tons of sketches that were out there, and he open sourced or did open availability in Creative Commons of an awful lot of the models, and an awful lot of them I will use regularly. But this one is quite apropos, which is complex systems are made out of people. And it doesn't take a whole lot of people to get things to be very complex very quickly. So coming back to sort of those different sort of depth of social, or the social perspectives, and understanding scaling, and what models work at different social scalings. So the team and small group model works really well for the collective model. You really can't get, it's about 12 people, 15 people with a collective model before it starts breaking. Being able to have, in the cooperative model, being able to have a team, it's right around that 12 to 15 people where it starts breaking badly. Sort of a 3 to 5, 3 to 8 is sort of optimal. Anything with social scaling, it's essentially, it's a plus or minus about half, if not the whole number, for where it starts taking effect. Because you will find times where things that are happening at social scales of around 75 and maybe 25 people, where some organizations are running into it. Other organizations, they don't hit that same hurdle until about 150 or so. And then they will hit it. There is no escaping what those hurdles are. It just depends on when you're going to hit them and at what scale. And for the cooperative and the group size, you start looking up around 300 or so, where you start hitting a maximal point where people start leaving groups and groups start splintering. Communities, you're looking around 1,500 sometimes to around 3,000. having coherent community before they start splitting. And sometimes you have communities of communities working at different scales, but just having good interaction. People know where to find things. And one of the things you find in urban populations, um, and it's sort of why subdivisions and large subdivisions are somewhere between 4,000 people and 7,000 people. One is that number is relevant for when you need an elementary school and a fire department. But it's also relevant to where people understand familiarity and see familiar faces. Right around that 4,000 to 7,000 mark, people can see faces over a year, and they recognize people that this is a part of my neighborhood, this is part of my community. One of the pieces of research that Foursquare did, and looking at how far people traveled for shopping, going to get food at restaurants and so forth, was essentially 4 city blocks in New York. They had a point around home and they had a point around work, and people rarely traveled outside of that 4 city block realm. And one of the things that's interesting is the count for an average New York City block is around 4,000 to 7,000 people. And you start getting outside that area, people start seeing people that aren't familiar, and they don't have sort of that comfort. I'm like, I don't recognize who this is. Are they going to come up and hug me? Is it going to be something that's going to make me uncomfortable, or something even, more harmful, or absolutely nothing could happen. But it's just like they don't have that comfort. And so it's interesting with that sort of 4,000 to 7,000 number, and communities starting to break sort of around a 4,000 to 7,000 number. And it was interesting being in Twitter very early, and that 4,000 to 7,000 number was right about the time where they stopped having the 24-hour scroll. Because you used to be able to drop into Twitter and you could see everything for the prior 24 hours. And you could just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling of people that you followed. And right around 7,000 to 8,000 people, which many of us thought this is just absolutely crazy. There's all these newbies coming and it's ruining everything. That was right about that 7,000 mark. And so the digital and the physical worlds, the thresholds for social, the transition points are right about that same point. The cooperative networks can run up into the hundreds of thousands, and up to millions and so forth, and there are breaking points there. And then if you're wanting to do collaborative development and in that torch making environment, you're back down at that team size of probably no more than 12 to 15 people. And so getting tools, understanding where you would like to have work done, how you'd like to do things, what are you going to support, and where are you going to support them at what levels, it's important to understand the scaling size. And one of the things, again, coming back to that I have an awful lot of, is understanding of teams. And the things that are relevant within teams is understanding that each person has their own network connections. So they have a mapping out to their communities. Each person has their communities, their groups that they participate in. Each person is not their own person, and the wall stops just at them, but they're bringing their past experiences and all of their connections to things. And in very much a hierarchy approach, work gets done not by hierarchy, but essentially through those networks of connections. So if you're trying to continually improve and you're trying to help work get done in intelligent and helpful ways, being able to enable those networked connections to happen and to bring people in to share what you're working on, but then also being able to get input on it. And when you get stuck, being able to put a question out, capture what that result is, being able to provide feedback if it worked or not, that becomes really helpful. And then one of the things that's really helpful related to tools is understanding what are the common tool needs. And quite often there are pieces of these that are missing or not optimal. Quite often we'll, in probably about the last 10 years, have started using jobs to be done as a model and framing, how do you get this job done? How do you do communication? How do you do calendaring? Or events, where do you share your resources? Is this working well? Is it not? How are each of these things being done? And quite often you find out that there's really high deficiencies in what is being provided, and things are not working optimally. So being able to have good tools to support teams and in different roles is incredibly important. And so this was sort of a mix of different lenses for those following on with lenses. So the Cynefin framework is essentially a lens, an external lens, and then just being able to have different team understandings. And those are subcomponents of other things that lenses that I have. Yep. We must wait for the build. Looking next at roles. Roles are something that are quite often not well understood. So we've got traditional roles, which are essentially the functional role. You have a senior developer, you've got a sales engineer, you have someone who is in charge of sales and direct sales, internal sales, however whatever the functions are. Quite often people have a hierarchy role. Are they in management? Are they, at a lower level than management level? What management level are they at? And then where are they within an organization? Are they within HR? Are they in a division? Which division are they in? So understanding each of these different roles, how they come together, they will have different influences and impacts as to how people view the world and interact with the world. Looking at how people interact with each other and within the social environments, one of the things that I had sort of stumbled into and being able to essentially have people look at the social roles, and most tools have a admin and a user. But looking at how people work dynamically within them, there are really distinct roles that start happening. Being able to put a name to the roles, quite often they will fall back on personality traits. It is not something necessarily that they learned. And when I walk through the social roles, quite often there are business folks in the room that want to know how they can train people to be that certain role, and how to have that certain personality trait that makes that role very easy and natural for them, which is not necessarily understanding how these roles work. Understanding sort of what tasks are tied to the roles. So if you're wanting to have a tool support those roles, what are the tasks that people are doing within these roles, and what do the roles need to be successful or to help them actually function well? So looking at the roles within social platforms, one of the things that is quite often the core focus is people who are sharing. You have a sharer, they sometimes are sharing anything, everything. And it may not be developed, may not be edited, but they are just sharing things out. That is their focus, which is fine. Another one that commonly pops up is the lurker. People who are not participating, they just are sort of hanging out, not asking questions, not favoriting. They're sort of the non-contributing users. And one of the things that is quite often missed is that the lurker is actually a very important role, because quite often what is happening with the lurker is that they are sharing outside of what you can see. They are sharing back with their team, they are sharing with others. What they are picking up within that environment is valuable, and they're finding it interesting, which is why they're coming back and why they are lurking. And sometimes they may just be lurking for pure entertainment value. And so there are different reasons, but being able to support a lurker, understand what they are doing, how they are working, and what role they take. Then where you have a sharer who is sharing everything, you have people who are essentially applying craft to it. They are writers, creators. They have methodologies behind things. So they're putting things out there to get honed. They are putting things out there to get shared, and for different purposes. Then you have editors who are essentially helping the writers and the creators hone what they have, which can be incredibly valuable, and are quite often a very important part of a social environment. You also have curators who are taking things from different areas and saying, uh, we've got a whole bunch of different collections of things that all have relevance to this new group that is starting up. Let's bring them together and aggregate them, and being able to make it easier to find, easier to understand these things that are disparate across the platform and across the social environment. It could be something that is done within a campfire model in the collaborative approach, or it could be at a higher level as well. The connectors are people who are connecting not only ideas, but essentially people. One of the companies that I worked with rather closely doing enterprise social platform was Socialcast. And Socialcast was quite good, and they got bought by VMware. And a couple years into VMware, I went back and visited them again. And they were talking about one of the VPs at VMware, where he would just sit in Socialcast and people would have questions, and they're like, oh, you're trying to figure out how to work with Southeast Asia market. I know the person in the company that you need to talk to. But they knew everybody who knew with expertise and depth on any question. And he would just sit there and spend an hour or two each day in the evening. And that was his way of sort of decompressing, was connecting people within the company that needed each other. And it was, once I found that out, I found other companies where the similar things were happening. And just being able to have that connector role of, oh, you do these things. And it was a role that I've had with a lot of my customers, where they would reach out and they're like, hey, do you know anybody who knows this really well? I'm like, oh yeah, you've got somebody in your own company that I know really well. Let me connect you. And they didn't have a way to find this person within their own company, but I knew them from the outside, and I was just always doing introduction time emails. It's like, so-and-so meet so-and-so, this person's background, discuss, be on your merry way. There's also synthesizers, being able to take ideas, being able to pull things together, coming up with new ideas, new understandings out of things that people haven't connected before. You also have theorizers, things that are not necessarily understood, and people trying to figure out what are the connections, why is this happening, essentially taking sort of sensory roles, where is this relevant, why is this happening, and quite often what comes out of theorizers that you get sort of a collective group starting, and it's like, is there anything to this theory? And being able to work through things, and quite often dealing with academic papers, research, other things to find out what's going on, how and why. You also have the mitigator and the negotiator for your collaborative environments, being able to support both of those roles. You also have contextualizers, people that will go in and be able to explain, this is why this is happening, or this is what is going on. So it's essentially not theory, but it's just, our sales went down within this last quarter, and like, oh, there was a economic slump in this global region of the world. Of course, our sales are going to be down by a quarter or whatever. But being able to add context that may be missed by others is quite often really helpful. You also have the interloper, which is sort of a lurker that is bouncing between different things within your own community and your own social environments. And so they'll bounce from one environment, take and drop it into, they will drop it into another group and say, hey, I heard this from another group, or this seemed to be really helpful. So essentially they're cross-pollinating ideas between different areas.
Thomas Shasta had a really interesting question in the chat. He asked if you have noticed any patterns, or are there sort of clusters of roles that you've seen more often than others, or that people seem to take on?
Sometimes there are. This is one of the ones where it fractures in many different ways. And it's very much a fractal, where it's just like, you'll find people who are sort of interlopers, infovores, and also connectors. But it's like not necessarily the same thing. And an awful lot of it's driven by various personality traits, but then also background, cultural background as well. The infovores are essentially much like a connector, but essentially around information. Someone will have a question and like, oh, I know of an academic paper or a journal article related to that. Let me forward it to you. And they seem to have their fingers on an awful lot of things just because they are sort of scanning and triaging an awful lot of information across many different ideas and domains, looking for things of interest for themselves, but then also have a good sort of pattern recognition for being able to know where things are relevant to others as well. You have people who are in there just as a learner. They're trying to understand things. Could be that they are new to an idea, domain, company, division, but being able to work through those environments. Also, you have people who are monitoring. So essentially sort of having making sure things are functioning really well, nothing sort of getting out of hand. If there are spikes in interaction or sharing, making sure that there's nothing sort of wayward going on. You also have counselors and people that sort of take a counselor role when people sort of step on each other's toes, being able to walk people through, they may not have meant this, or being able to counsel people who may have said something that was a little bit out of turn and hurt other people's feelings. So being able to have that counselor role, quite often it's rare that there's an environment that doesn't have sort of a counselor that sort of pops up just to keep things sane. You also have a gossip. And this is actually one of the roles that sometimes gets manufactured. Because gossips will sometimes, when things get quiet, the gossip will pop up just to churn things up and start spreading rumors or asking provoking questions. And so it's when I stumbled on companies and organizations that within their customer communities will have gossips that they sort of seed information to. Is this company actually going to do X, or this new product going to have this new functionality, and they will seed that sort of information to get people discussing it. And it's like people going, no, this is a really bad idea. I would never buy anything like this. They're like, okay, let's not go down that path. So it becomes, it's one of the few that is not sort of an organic role. You also have sort of the.
I just want to have one clarifying question here, which is that these roles are observational. They're not labels necessarily, right? Like you don't want to label people with these roles.
Right.
These are roles that are emergent within the organization that you have observed.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
And in large communities, in a community of more than like 500 people, you will quite often find each one of these roles happening. And the tools mostly do not support these roles. So people are doing these tasks, finding their own shortcuts, methods, and ways of working with things. And so it becomes, and working with the vendors who are creating the platforms, they weren't aware of all of these. And they're like, wow, these would be really helpful. I'm like, just pick 2 or 3 that would be helpful. And start building them out, or have customers that are just like, yeah, these would be really good to support. Figure out which are good to support and highlight them, and work with the vendors to be able to enable that. And quite often sort of a mitigator, a negotiator, being able to have curators. Those are things that pop up quite early. Quite often you also have experts. Interesting thing with expert is quite often the expert is not active or highly active. Quite often the expert has a full-time role they are trying to do with a job. And so they will lightly respond. They may share information out. But sort of the common thing that happens is that there is a broadcaster, rebroadcaster that is taking what is happening and things that are shared from the experts, and essentially they are the front person for the expert. Sometimes it's intentional. it's a formal relationship between them. Quite often it is not. It is just somebody saying, hey, this person has interesting information. And so it's one of the things that's interesting is I've run into companies who do not like experts. They think that they are troublesome. But then when they get rid of them, they realize that they have a severe problem because they no longer have the knowledge and the understanding to do things. But then there's also an oddity. It's not necessarily an oddity because it happens quite frequently, which is where you've got the expert and the broadcaster, rebroadcaster collaboration going on, is that the company will think that the broadcaster is actually the expert because they are the ones who they are hearing this information from. And so they will get rid of the expert, and all of a sudden they hold on to the broadcaster and rebroadcaster and thinking that this is the person who understands everything. And then all of a sudden they don't have that information any longer. And they will talk to them and they're like, hey, what happened to your good ideas? And they're like, that was all the person you just got rid of. And so it becomes really interesting to just sort of to watch these dynamics as they flow out.
Yes, Shasta, I agree that some of these probably are situational, both for the company and for the person, the individual. You know, my role may be as an expert in one context in the organization and as a rebroadcaster in another.
Yep. Yeah. The expert quite often doesn't have time because they are usually completely overstretched. So it's usually rare that the expert will be heavily involved or have another role that they're taking on. It's not to say it doesn't happen. I know quite a few situations where it does, but commonly the expert they're very happy to have somebody sort of be their broadcaster, rebroadcaster. And being able to, when questions come in, have it hit the broadcaster. And then they can say, hey, here are the top questions. Can you answer these when you have downtime? They'll take the answers to things and then share them back out, just in a time-saving manner. Jumping to model of attraction, I'll run through. This one goes through quickly. There's 2 pieces tied to this.
Okay, good, because I want to leave some time for questions, because I have questions if no one else does, and we're getting close to 2:00, so. Yep.
Yeah, I will skip the folksonomy piece. There's an awful lot written and out on folksonomy. I'll wrap with model of attraction. So model of attraction is essentially where all of this started. And essentially realizing that the focus of the web had changed from what it was, which was an I go get web. We sought their information. We focused on the content provider. It was essentially about one device, which was the desktop, which is where we consumed the information. It essentially had one use, which was essentially reading it or consuming the information. We weren't necessarily doing a whole lot with it. And essentially it was in proprietary formats. Quite often was in, things like Flash, other things that were not, you couldn't easily repurpose things. There was not open sharing. It was in document types that you needed a license to be able to use. It was relatively difficult to share information and have it sort of spread. And lastly, findability was the focus. Where do I find this? How do I get this information? And what it switched to currently is a come to me web, which is, it is about our information we found or created. When you talk to people about what they know or what they have and how they think about things, it's all in the perspective of, oh, this, I have this. I understand this. I'm like, oh, you want to understand Dave Snowden's Cynefin framework? Here, I've got a really good document on it in PDF, or here's a link to go find things. But it's essentially as people are taking ownership of information that they have run across and or created. And that distinction is not necessarily clear in people's heads as to what is theirs, what came from elsewhere. Quite often people can point to where it came from, but things get really muddled, and that is more or less a norm. The focus is on the person using the information, being able to have user-centric design, being able to look at the customer, how people are using things, building tools and services on the person using, rather than on, hey, we're putting this information out, everybody's got to love us. We're not necessarily worried about our customers. We're the only way to get this information or this tool or service. But it also became about reuse, being able to have information where you could capture something, share it out with another group. You could take information, drop it into Twitter, you could drop it into MySpace, you could drop it into wherever, and be able to get a conversation going essentially apart from where that information initially started. Quite often it would link back to the initial source, but things became to be much more distributed. It wasn't necessarily one single central node. The attracting and keeping things attractive became the focus. And so you're essentially, if you've got that mindset of attracting things and the model of attraction rather than going and finding things, one of the things that quickly becomes relevant is, how do I keep this attracted to myself? I found it, I like it, I want to hold on to this. I want to be able to use it in a paper that I'm working on. I want to be able to read other resources. How do I get it so that it follows me? It's sort of that late 90s, early 2000s technical nirvana. It's always at my fingertips when I want it and need it, no matter where I am. Being able to work across devices, no longer just sitting at a desktop, but having information and access to things in our pocket, in our laptop, tablets, TV screens, now eyeballs. Wherever we have attention to give, however we have attention to give, we have capability to get access or re-access that information. We switched to more open formats, shifting away from proprietary formats where things were locked away, moving to more open formats, being able to take information, use and reuse information. And lastly, refindability is the focus as much as findability. So I know that I have seen this. How do I get back to it? I don't remember what it's called. I know that it was helpful. Being able to have some contextual strings that we can pull on and bring things back together. So now looking at the receptors for a model of attraction. So if you've got a model of attraction and you no longer have navigation as your metaphor, it allows you to think about 4 different things that are highly relevant, and being able to keep them in mind with each one of the things that you're building and creating. So the first one to start with is intellectual. So what is it called? How do people think about it? Sort of what level of sort of education level are you writing to, sharing things out to? Who's the expected audience? Does it resonate with them, with that expected audience? So how do I find things? How do I refine things? The intellectual is a common piece of that. The perceptual is the next. What does it look like? Essentially, what's sort of the feel, texture, in common parlance now? What is the vibe? One of the examples that I used for many years was Jacob Nielsen, who was one of the people at the forefront of pitching and marketing user-centered design and usability. His website looked like it was straight out of the late 90s. It was very rough. A lot of the things that he talked about, he did not embrace, and we were not part of his website. And if you talk to somebody who was an interaction designer and very visual designer, they would look at Jacob Nielsen's site as somebody who did not know what they were talking about. So the perceptual was in complete contrast and conflict with the intellectual. So being able to understand the perceptual and the intellectual becomes highly relevant, which are more or less sort of the I go get web mentality. But the 2 pieces that start coming in start breaking apart the I go get web to the come to me web, which is the mechanical. And thinking about what is the bandwidth, what is the network, how do I have enough bandwidth to be able to access a document? Do I have internet connection or connectivity? I've got a 4K video. Do I have enough bandwidth to be able to watch that? Can I get a transcript of it? What are the different ways that I can get to this? But what are the mechanical components from a device, from the internet connection, to be able to enable access to it and use of whatever it is that you're providing? And lastly, is the physical. What physical attributes does the person who is using this need to bring or have available to them? So if you're thinking about information um, that you're putting out at the end of a workday and it is aimed at people who are in transit headed home from work, and they're holding on in the subway with one hand, using mobile device in the other, you need to be able to make sure that there is one hand to be able to use for it, and not having two hands that are going to be needed for it. If you have something that is on a TV screen or in a virtual environment, what are the physical attributes that are needed to interact with that environment or what you're putting out there? If you're doing something for an operating room, for surgeons, they don't have hands that they're able to interact with it. So what they have is eyes, and they have ears and voice to be able to interact with things, to be able to understand the physical attributes that they have to interact with that information and that media. Is not going to be hands. It is not going to be something that where touch is a relevant component. So understanding the physical attributes somebody needs to bring or has available to them is really important when you're thinking about access to information and sharing information. And the last part of this, for the Come to Me web, is essentially thinking about things in 4 different info clouds. So the info clouds break down into a personal info cloud, which is your own personal repositories. Could be a couple cloud drives. It could be things on your mobile device, could be on your desktop. How do you sync things between them? How do you make sure at the end of the day, things that you want to have available at home or on your mobile device to read on your commute home are available to you, being able to have agents to move things around as needed? Or how do you be able to hold on to something and keep something attracted to you that you find out on the internet? You've read an article that you want to hold on to, put it in a collection with others for reading and cross-referencing. So being able to have a personal info cloud that works across your devices and across your connections. The next is a global info cloud, which is essentially the internet. So if you need to turn to Google for something, you don't have people that you know, you don't have common connections, you go to the global info cloud and start digging around, essentially using search. These days, you may turn to a chat tool to be able to say, hey, give me some recommendations for this, because I don't know where to turn to. One of the other ones is the external info cloud, which are things that are in another language, behind a firewall, behind a paywall. They're not accessible to you. Quite often, information you want, need, or desire maybe in an external info cloud. Figuring out, one, that it exists is sort of that first step, and then being able to figure out how to get access to it is sort of that second. And essentially being able to take that external info cloud and turn it into one of your local info clouds, which are break down into a few different elements. One is by location. So local info cloud for location might be something like Yelp, being able to find a barbecue or a Thai restaurant, or turning to Google Maps to do your what am I going to have for dinner or where am I going for dinner exercises. It also can be friends and family. Quite often we don't store the information ourselves. We know that when we're making our favorite chocolate chip cookie recipe, our aunt knows whether it is 1 egg or 2 eggs. We know that it is wrong in the recipe that we have that says 3 eggs. So every time we go to make the chocolate chip cookies, it's our opportunity to reach out to our aunt because the information is stored there. Quite often we store information with friends and they're just like, well, like, hey, where was that tiki bar you went to in the East Village? Someone's able to say, here, this is the tiki bar, is now open on just Wednesdays and Thursday nights. That's it. But essentially that information is stored within people that we know how to access it, know how to query it and get that information back. We also have resources that are near in thought. This can be groups, back channels, Slack channels on various discussion areas. We have affiliations, which can be organizations that we belong to. They may have discussion boards, ways to interact with people, be able to ask questions, get responses, work, obviously. We know where to go. Sometimes we know where to go within work to find answers to our questions. Being able to query it, know where things are stored, knowing how to access them. Then social software, being able to go out to, Mastodon, being able to go to Threads, being able to go to Facebook, ask questions, find out what's going on, share information. We don't hold on to it ourselves, but we know where to go query it. And then lastly, portals, which are less and less of a thing, but still exist to some degree, sometimes around things that are near in thought. If you're in gaming, you can go to gaming portals, find out what is new, get downloads, updates, patches, and so forth. But essentially that is the sort of extent of the local info cloud. It is things that are familiar to us, places that we go and turn to. We don't hold the information ourselves necessarily, but we know where we can go query and get that information with relative ease. And with that, I'm going to skip the folksonomy piece and say thank you and open for questions.
Woohoo! Thank you, Thomas. That was awesome.
Welcome.
There's some places. There we go. Personal Info Cloud, LinkedIn. He's everywhere. So
not everywhere anymore. I used to be everywhere.
We've lost some people because of timing. So yep. Anybody have any questions?
I mean,
oh yeah? Where?
Can I go? It's Robert. Can I talk?
Yes.
Oh yeah?
Yes,
Please.
Robert.
Okay. I'm interested in very many complex issues, and I find a general resistance to complexity with the average person. Do you have any advice for complexity adversity? And because the culture in general tends to want to make things simple, and everyone's overwhelmed that they want it simple. So how do you fight this bias?
It's essentially why I have the lenses, which is essentially being able to, I don't have the lenses fully open and available. Usually we'll talk to folks about what their problem sets are, what they believe that their needs are, what they are trying to do. And we'll ask them about how they are going about trying to find things, and to build a better approach. And quite often, sort of the who is interested in the lenses or who the lenses work for, people who have essentially thrown millions of dollars at different solutions that didn't work, and they are thinking about doing that once again, but don't want to have the same result. And so being able to realize that, there are some complexity is built of small, simple elements, but there's an awful lot of them converging at the same point and place, pushing things in unintended directions because you don't understand the elements that you are looking at. And so anytime that you introduce a new element into a complex environment, it's going to change the whole environment, quite often with unintended consequences, but also, you can get some intentional output with benefit as well, but being able to understand what is going on, the other things that you are dealing with. And the lenses are essentially aimed at taking some of those relatively simple ideas, putting them out there relatively simply, and being able to have people go, yeah, this is relevant to me or not. I have a need here, or I see an area where could be a problem, and being able to set those aside. And this essentially is built out of people's adversity to complexity and not wanting to deal with the reality of complexity. And there's a slide that I have, which is a quote from one of my friends. And in 2004, there was a bunch of us that met up in Amsterdam for a very small gathering, about 25 of us, called Design Engaged. And he gave the first talk. It was Mike Kianowski. And he was talking about complexity. and essentially looking at designers and innovators as people who are the ones who dealt with complexity. The people who were behind things didn't necessarily need to deal with the complexity, but you need to have people who are willing to stand up to complexity, understand it, willing to sort of battle and sort of tear complexity apart to understand the small pieces that are relevant and build it back together. And at the end of his talk, he said, those of us in this room are all the ones who need to run to the light of complexity. It isn't for everybody. Some are going to be put off by it. But you do need people in your environment if you are building things and working through things in complex environments, which is pretty much everything, that are willing to embrace that complexity and sort of be that buffer for others that would like a more simple world. They only want vanilla ice cream and maybe they want an orange creamsicle, but that is as far as the complex world is going to invade into their life. And we can be that buffer for them.
Thank you.
That
You're
was
welcome.
helpful, Robert. Great. Anybody else?
Question.
Yes, Tiani.
I really appreciate the different views into the social interactions, the team types, even beyond the team types, like the community versus or the groups, the community, the collaborators, the different ways people get together to either do something or just share information. Like there's some purpose behind that.
Yep.
And then when you went into the actual the types of the kind of like high level profiles of how people interact with information, whether they're like actively contributing or I'm lurking to like learn or listen or consuming in some other kind of way, or I'm connecting things that I see or I'm curating, that kind of thing.
Yep.
And the thing that is behind the question I put in the channel is about value, particularly when you talked about how like the expert sometimes is wanted, sometimes they're not. And so what have you seen and what have you learned about what's valued or what's considered? And it seems to me that all of those emergent types and profiles, whether they're from the team level to the individual and how you consume information or how you do work, there's value because that's just how the network functions, and there's like a need for those things, and they serve a purpose, and they enable something. And yet some of those seem to be like more like a shadow, maybe more in the forefront, more visible, others more of a shadow, and less understood, and therefore maybe less valued. And I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's one of the slides. So first time I presented it, I essentially knew that I had something really good because I lost all the faces in the room behind a camera or behind a phone. But it was also one of the things that I wish I could get in front of leadership. And just being able to have them understand there are many different roles and contributions that people have. And that all of them together essentially make up a whole. If we are missing pieces of it, we've got problems. And particularly at, relative scale of, you can quite often find those 20 roles in a group of 40 people and have each one of those roles covered. Quite often people may play more than one role. Some, like the expert, they very rarely are playing more than one role. They may be a creator, they may be a writer as well as being an expert. But not necessarily, they likely are not going to be an editor. They may be an infovore because that's how they got to sort of that expert status and got to know what they know. But it's just, being able to understand that each of these are valuable and being able to figure out if you've got gaps. And it's really difficult to figure out if you have gaps as well. Other than, some of the things that sort of fall into the background, like the infovore, you don't necessarily know that you are missing an infovore. But if you're having questions that pop up and people aren't sort of responding, it's kind of a key that you're missing either an expert or sort of an infovore. someone who has been there or sharing, or it could be that you have a social comfort problem. And that social comfort problem is also problematic. And which is, if you have somebody who knows the answer, sort of what is holding them back from sharing. And some have done work with universities, and there used to be academic social software symposiums that would pop up. And one of the things that was interesting, that friends of mine who are professors who were using social tools in their classroom, one of the things that they were finding was they would have, students had a blog, the professor had a blog, students had a blog. They were also doing social bookmarking, but they also needed to give presentations, and they also had regular papers. And so there was different ways that you could participate. And the professors were finding that between a blog and a paper, they also had tests and in-class presentations. No one student did all four of them well. There were people who blogged like crazy, and they were horrible presenting, and they did not like presenting at all. They would not speak up in class. And class participation was not what they felt comfortable doing, but they could sure blog the hell out of any idea and pull things together. And just being able to understand that having different avenues for people to be able to contribute, and having an understanding that people are comfortable in many different ways at different scales, is something that is relevant. A good friend of mine went to go grab tea with her when she was in town. And as we were walking to go get tea, she's like, "Thomas, you're one of the broken ones with us." And she's like, how you see the world, you can look at everything. You could walk into the Sistine Chapel and all you see is cracks, and sort of see the problems. But she's like, you also don't care about being wrong. And you also are comfortable standing up in front of a room with 1,000 people and talking, which is, a very unusual trait. And it's just, it's essentially the broken ones. We're outside the norm. Quite often either we are risk adverse, or we don't know that there is risk, or we don't care about the risk. We just are willing to do or have interest in doing, for whatever reason. And so it's just being able to understand essentially the complexity of humanity, of all the different mindsets and all of it coming together, and having that diversity in one place and working together is highly valuable. Where you have a lack of diversity, you've got usually an excess of problems and gaps. And it's more than the diversity, it's just the different ways of thinking and interacting. So having as many outlets as possible for as diverse of a group as you can get quite often leads to, it's what you were trying to solve in a collective group that is trying to understand a problem set. If you've got gaps, you try to fill the gaps with a lack of understanding your lack of understanding, or that diversity. You want to make sure that you've got coverage on that understanding, and understanding what is relevant and important.
Yeah.
So it's in having leadership that understands that, and just being able to, quite often there are some leaders that look for people like themselves. There are some leaders that look for people that have capabilities beyond what they do, and they bring those in. And so it's sort of a leadership question. Are they a limiting leader, or are they an expanding leader and embracing?
Yep. Makes sense.
Hey, anything else? Anyone else have a question? Well, before we close out, I would just say, Thomas, that I'd be really interested in seeing you expand more on this question of scale, because
Right.
I think that one of the things these lenses would be very helpful for is something that, Jeffrey West has alluded to it since he wrote the book as well, which is
Right.
that we always talk about the benefits of scale,
Right.
but the negatives of scale, the negatives are
Right.
often scaling hand in hand.
Right.
But we don't really see that until something goes horribly wrong.
Right.
Or until the problem is so big that we can't ignore it anymore. And I
Yeah.
think that your lenses are would be a good way to sort of start to look at scale in
Yep.
multiple ways before you actually embark on the project.
Right. And one of the so the right fitting digital activities to appropriate scale, essentially inherent is that in that is understanding even at network scale, you have all these other scales that are happening at the exact same time. And things work at different levels all at the same time and need to work together. And very much like what I was just mentioning to Tiani of, having people that are comfortable in different environments. Most people have a social comfort in a group of 5 to 8 people. And if the environment is right, everybody will contribute and interact with each other. And so being able to have have another lens, which essentially looks at, it's framed as freely seeping through the garden walls, and it looks at that scale because people are comfortable in small closed environments where they know everybody. If they know that this is going to be shared out publicly, they are going to say something very different. And that comes up in another lens as well, which is essentially being able to get the ability to share information pattern correct with capturing everything you are thinking first, then figuring out where you are going to share pieces of that, rather than having everything shared publicly and then you are editing things down, which means you are not capturing what you are fully thinking. So if you're capturing everything for yourself and then dispersing it, that becomes a very more robust full capture of everything. And you may want to hold things back for various reasons. If you're going to be sharing something publicly, or if you're going to be sharing something with 100 people, knowing the reach of what you are sharing is really important. Which is why understanding that all the different scales are happening all at the same time, with each with their own value and purpose, all building to the whole, but they need to be able to interconnect and communicate between them.
Okay.
But yeah, I've got more things on those.
You have more. Okay, good.
Got a whole lot more. But it's just sort of like the Robin Dunbar number of 150. And it's like, it's not his number. It's essentially one of his numbers of many scales where things are important. And just, looking at, human encampment models and at the different scales where they get a fire department, where they get roads, where they get lamps, where you've got a newspaper, where you've got an education system, where you're building roads to the outside, where you have police and so forth. Those sorts of same things happen at different scales, and just sort of what the mind can work with at various scales digitally and in physical world is pretty much the same. And there's been a few when Twitter was more open and you had access to data, there was an awful lot of research looking at the average number of people that individuals connected with and interacted with, and it was right around 70, which is sort of the half number of 150 of Dunbar. And quite often people would follow celebrities, but they would have their group of 70 where they would share things with, or say, hey, have you seen this, and other things. And I'm like, the numbers, whether it's digital or analog, and early on there was a lot of us that were like, what is the digitally augmented Dunbar number? Yeah. And oddly, it was a bunch of us who were the broken ones who were asking each other. And at that point I had about 2,500 people in my address book, and I could give a story about each one of them. And I would do that over holiday break each year. And that is not a usual thing. But also just being able to, understand sort of that 4,000 to 7,000 of a neighborhood, and having that social comfort, or that comfort in that neighborhood, and knowing who people are, knowing the patterns, how people interact in that neighborhood. And just sort of, people pushing the boundaries of how far away from home are you willing to go or work, to go get lunch or to go do shopping or so forth. And it's interesting in a place like New York where everything is infinitely available within a walk, depending on how long you have to walk. And yet people are staying within a 4-block radius for the most part. And so it's just, which is sort of that same model for, planned communities, other things, walled communities, gated communities.
I mean, in New York, it's also that you might run into somebody you don't like. So,
Yeah.
you have to you have to make sure, you have to balance like the possibility here.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, does anyone have anything else? Okay. Well, on that note, Thomas, I want to say thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome. I have enjoyed it immensely. And isn't that all that really matters?
Yes.
For those of you that have hung with us, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your energy. That you guys coming is, well, other than our own satisfaction, you're one of the reasons we hold these things. If you should pay attention to your meetup announcements next month, because there might be two meetups next month. So watch your calendars. Keep Tuesdays open. Thank you so much. And Thomas, thank you again. You are awesome.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.